So far this afternoon, we've discussed new reactor development and leadership, two ingredients that are essential for the industry to thrive in the coming decades. And now we're going to pick up on a similar theme with a panel of advocates on new nuclear. Moderating the panel this afternoon will be Bill Mohl, President of Entergy Wholesale Commodities. Bill's responsible for Entergy's merchant power business and a member of NEI's executive committee. Joining Bill will be a panel of thought leaders who are helping to lay the policy groundwork for new nuclear facilities. The panelists this afternoon are Matt Bennett, co-founder and senior vice president for public affairs at Third Way, a Washington, D.C.-based think tank, Ben Hurd, director of Think Climate Consulting, and Rachel Pritzker, founder and president of the Pritzker Innovation Fund and chairman of the Breakthrough Institute. Please join me in welcoming Bill Mohl.
So do the introduction? Okay.
Yes, okay.
All right, good afternoon. So a little bit of a tough act to follow coming after Peyton, but I will tell you that I think you're going to enjoy the panel this afternoon. Bring some excitement back from a development perspective to what we need to think about in this country in terms of development of new technologies. So even as we make significant progress towards commercial development of Generation 3 reactors in South Carolina and Georgia and elsewhere around the world, we are exploring the next generation of nuclear technologies. The industry and U.S. Department of Energy have demonstrated a commitment to investment in private-public partnership programs to develop and license both advanced light water and advanced non-light water reactor designs. In fact, in January of this year, DOE funded cost-share awards with up to $80 million over 5 years to X-Energy and Southern Company. In partnership with national laboratories, universities, and other entities for research and development of these advanced reactor designs. The DOE SMR Licensing Technical Support Cost-Share Program is also helping to support the development of NuScale's design certification application to the NRC. The program is also helping to support licensing activities for prospective customers. So industry supports the continuation and expansion of these cost-share programs for advanced non-light water reactors and SMRs. These Generation 4 advanced reactors will build on the advantage of designs being built today with even more advanced systems and greater cost efficiency. Demonstration of advanced reactors by 2025 and commercial deployment in the 2030 to 2035 timeframe are ambitious but achievable goals. So these long lead times create opportunity, yet also present challenges for our industry in aligning around that commitment. Some might think that the industry is a bit schizophrenic on Generation 4 reactors. Younger engineers are excited about technology and the prospect of injecting ingenuity into the industry. Current industry leaders, particularly those with a focus on a narrow horizon, may think it's something for future generations to worry about. You know, I was talking a little bit with the panelists at the beginning, and so I come from a utility background, and you know what, we're focused on shutting down plants because of competitive situation in the markets, low natural gas prices, and looking at deploying either gas-fired combined cycles or renewable technologies because those are in vogue and economic, and those are the technologies you can actually get support for in the regulatory process. So today we're going to hear a little bit different perspective about how to think about the new technologies that will be coming about in the next decade. It will also, meeting our overall goal to maintain nuclear generation will require public-private collaboration, innovative policies, and licensing and regulatory structures that facilitate the efficient and predictable deployment of new technologies and encourage private investment. It will also require that we leverage the capabilities of our vendors and suppliers, energy companies, universities, national labs, and federal agencies. Bringing advanced reactor technology to market will take a level of effort and commitment well beyond the status quo. We know what the fight has been to keep existing nuclear generation. The fight will be even harder to bring on new technologies. However, it also promises advantages well beyond our current reactors. These innovative systems can provide tremendous dividends, including global leadership in advanced technology and economic competitiveness, clean air benefits, as well as national security benefits, not to mention sustain our industry workforce for those studying today in the disciplines that will be needed for success and future generations. In a departure from most panels, we're going to be in our discussion today with you, the audience. We want your engagement in a series of polling questions, and the first one is on the screen now. Please take a minute and use your smartphones to participate in this question. Also, at this time, I'd like to introduce our panelists. As Director of Think Climate Consulting, Ben Hurd has delivered major environmental initiatives for government, private, and not-for-profit clients. His appreciation of the climate crisis forced an evidence-based rethink of its long-held opposition to nuclear power. His work was influential in a proposal from the South Australian Nuclear Fuel Cycle Royal Commission to link multinational fuel storage with advanced reactor and fuel recycling development. Ben is taking doctoral studies at the University of Adelaide examining pathways for the introduction of nuclear power, and in particular, advanced nuclear energy system into Australia's electricity market. Next, Rachel Pritzker, founder and president of the Pritzker Innovation Fund, which supports the development and advancement of paradigm-shifting ideas to address, in their own words, the world's most wicked problems. The fund is currently focused on a range of climate, energy, and conservation issues. If you're a fan of TED Talks, I recommend Rachel's TED Talk on energy myths, climate poverty, and a reason to hope. Next is Matt Bennett, Senior Vice President for Public Affairs at Third Way. In 2005, Matt joined 3 co-founders in establishing Third Way for fresh thinking and moderate ideas in a time of extreme political polarization. Third Way has been an early participant in the policy conversation about advanced reactors, and in fact, sponsored an advanced reactor forum and showcase earlier this year in Washington. Matt served as Deputy Assistant to the President for Intergovernmental Affairs in the Clinton White House, where he was the principal White House liaison to governors and covered issues such as disaster response, Medicaid, and immigration. Please welcome our guests. You bet. Okay, the format we're going to use is we're going to let each of the panelists give a kind of brief overview on their point of view on this topic. And so, Matt, we'll go ahead and kick it off with you.
All right, thanks, Bill. As a Democrat, it's delightful to be here in the Donald J. Trump ballroom. And the reason that I've ventured into this lion's den is that at Third Way, we really believe that the people in this room and your colleagues are doing the most exciting and important work of any industry on the planet. And I have to say that that sounds a little different than some of the things that I've been hearing at this conference. There's been a lot of talk, as Bill noted, about plants shutting down and long lead times and regulatory difficulty and a whole bunch of hard things. But as one Democratic president said a while back, we do these things not because they're easy, but because they're hard and because they're extraordinarily important. Now, Rachel will talk a little bit about this, but we believe that nuclear power can and will actually save the world. That is a big idea, but it is one that is extraordinarily important for you all to hear and to think about. We are never going to reach our climate goals if we just focus on the things that are in vogue at the moment. You all know that. So Third Way has taken it upon ourselves to work in conjunction with Rachel and with a few other groups in Washington to help clear away some of the hurdles that you face as an industry to get Generation 4 reactors to market. The two things that we're focused on most, and we talked about this at the summit that we held in January, are, and they were raised in the earlier panel, opening the doors of the national labs in ways that are actually usable for some of the 50-odd companies that are working on Generation 4 reactors right now, and working with the NRC and with Congress to ensure that there's a regulatory pathway. I very much agreed with some of the things that the earlier panel was saying, that the NRC is really doing better than people give them credit for, that they're working in good faith to meet the challenge of regulating something that they've never seen in 60 years of operation. But they're going to need help from Congress. They're going to need a push from Congress. And the great news for all of you is that that seems to be forthcoming at the moment. In a time of ridiculous partisan gridlock in Washington, where they can't even name a post office effectively, we have seen unanimous votes in the House. And we just saw a vote in the Senate on a nuclear bill that passed by 17-3 in the Environment and Public Works Committee. Voting for the bill was Ed Markey, probably the biggest bête noire of nuclear in the Senate, in the Congress. And Markey was willing to do this and to join a bill that was sponsored by Jim Inhofe, who was the #1 climate denier in the Senate, because they both recognized there is enormous potential for this new industry, but there is a real need for Congress to be involved in helping to change the way we regulate something that hasn't changed much in decades. So there is this extraordinary bipartisan consensus around the need to do these things. I was saying earlier, this is an industry at the moment, the Generation 4 industry, that has no known predators. There's no one out there trying to kill Generation 4 nuclear reactors, which is really good news, because there's a lot of predators in every other debate in Washington. And the other great thing is that the White House, this White House, and the Department of Energy have been working very hard to move the ball as far down the field as they can before the clock runs out on them in January. And the Assistant Secretary John Kotek and the guys running the national labs have introduced the GAIN initiative and other things that are going to take the first series of steps that will make the labs accessible to these, in many cases, very small companies to do the very important work they need to do to get these reactors built and then ultimately commercialized. So my message to you is the future is extraordinarily bright. It's not going to be easy, but it is absolutely going to be possible, and I'm delighted to work with as many of you as I can in helping to move that forward.
All right, thanks, Matt. So Rachel, you bring a unique perspective to this conversation today. You have a view of advanced reactors as a tool to help solve some of the most vexing global problems. But I understand that's not always been the case. So tell us a little bit more about your journey and your kind of point of view on the future.
So if you had told me 10 or even 5 years ago that I would be speaking to you here today, I would not have believed you. I was raised by hippie environmentalists who met on a commune, actually. And one of my very earliest memories was of grabbing the wrong corduroy bell-bottomed pants at an anti-nuclear rally, because from my height, they all looked the same. So when I began to look at the real numbers behind what it would take to address climate change, and the dual challenge of also lifting billions of people around the world out of poverty, I realized that all the focus from the environmental movement on a few popular technologies that have major challenges weren't going to get us there, and that almost everyone else was ignoring nuclear. So it was a multi-year process for me to actually come to terms with that fact. having been so steeped in the fear and the negative associations that nuclear has. And the gateway for me was advanced nuclear technologies. And I have seen it time and again, both in the political conversations, but also among environmental funders, that once you help break open their assumptions about what they think they know about nuclear by pointing out that there is another generation of technologies that offer different attributes that address a lot of their concerns, they can then, once they're comfortable with that idea and with those technologies, go back and go, you know what though, that current technology is actually pretty great too. So you saw it in some of the Senate committee hearings actually. Even when the committee hearing was meeting about advanced nuclear technologies, you had some of the climate hawks and the Democrats actually on that committee raising the issue of maintaining the current fleet, because they're now starting to see, they look at the numbers and they go, you know what, if these plants close, we're not going to meet our climate commitments. And so what you all do matters for the world. It matters for lifting people out of poverty. It matters if we want clean air. It matters if we want to address climate. And I think too often, because to be fair, you've had a lot of bad things have been said about nuclear. And it's understandable the kind of defensive crouch that it sometimes seems like the industry is in. But I just want to tell you that there is a new conversation. So along with myself, a number of other environmentalists are changing their minds. So we now have an ecosystem of think tanks and academics and advocates who initially came together to help fund and promote the film Pandora's Promise. And after the film came out, we met and we brought all the sort of smartest people we knew about, who knew about nuclear together, and we said, okay, what's next? Where are the opportunities to help this technology? And out of that meeting 2 years ago, Third Way being key players in this conversation, but a number of other groups as well, we began socializing nuclear in Washington, and having something new to say enabled us to just have tremendous impact. The number of people that wanted to hear about it, that wanted to talk about it, that wanted to hold events about it, because it was something new and also something that wasn't partisan, gave people comfort with having this conversation. So I know that even if your individual companies aren't in the advanced nuclear space, I think it's so important to help break open that stagnant conversation, which in DC had really been focused totally along partisan lines, mostly only on waste for a long time. And having something to say that's positive, having positive attributes to point to that most people don't know about, but having a future to point to rather than just a past to point to is so important. And the other thing I would say is having a human story, not just talking about safety, not just talking about the past or the technology in granular detail, being able to talk about the modern lives people are able to lead because of clean air and reliable power can really move people. So I just encourage you to use those, the lessons we've learned actually, having all these conversations in the last couple of years, to use those sort of approaches to humanize this industry, but also really help people understand why it matters, because what you do really, really matters. And also to let you know that there are now allies in the NGO space and even in the environmental space. So environmentalists are now not all, your enemies. So there are partners out there helping support what you do.
All right, thanks, Rachel. So Ben, Australia's been known for its vast deposits of uranium, and the conversation's been changing in Australia on nuclear issues to the point where you're now considering hosting an international spent fuel facility. So can you give us your insights as to what's driving that and the role that advanced technology plays?
Yeah, I'd love to. And I mean, what a turnaround. You know, if everybody thinks they have the most anti-nuclear country in the world. I'm pretty sure we do. We've actually outlawed it. Maybe the New Zealanders might be more anti-nuclear than us. But you know, Australia was a tough, very tough nuclear environment to commence in. And having been through a very similar process that was outlined by Rachel, that process of change and understanding and thinking about the issues and the numbers, I started talking about it about 5 years ago in Australia. And at that time, I was still having a lot of conversations from people that went something along the lines of, I really agree with everything you're saying and you're wasting your time. No one's going to change. Everyone thinks this about nuclear. It's just too hard. And I think I've already had that conversation twice here. That's incorrect. And if you're a data-driven industry, you've got to understand that that's not correct. Things do change. And things have changed dramatically in Australia in that 5-year period. And there are a lot of reasons for that, which I might hopefully explore a little in more of the discussion. But it's got to the point where my state government, a left party government with a leader from the left faction of that party, with a historical on-the-record opposition to matters nuclear, launched a $6 million investigation into whether or not our state could become more involved in the nuclear fuel cycle. And the recommendations flowing from that are several, including dismantling the legislative barriers that exist for nuclear, having a technology-neutral energy pathway for Australia so that nuclear can at least have a shot at competing and helping us meet our climate goals, and the core recommendation being a facility to host 140,000 tonnes of used fuel from the global market. Okay, so to provide that solution to the nuclear back end. So, you know, if there's a couple of things I'd ask, it would be that the words and the expressions like people don't change, it's too hard, they need to be struck from this industry's vocabulary. And preferably the thought processes that are underlying them need to be surgically excised and replaced with something a lot more honest and useful, maybe along the lines of, we don't know how to do that very well. Okay? Because it can be done, and if it's not happening, it's because you don't know how to do it very well, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. But it can be done, and we can do it better. And when I hear things like it's too hard, people don't change, what I hear is we find people more scary and mysterious than nuclear fission. So we'd like to look at our machines, please, and improve our processes and get our marginal costs ground down a little more, okay? And it's not good enough. And we can do way, way better. And there's great evidence for that happening right now. I'm amazed. I mean, a couple of years ago, watching from afar and beginning to visit, it felt like the US was kind of asleep at the wheel, frankly, in the nuclear sector. And now it seems to be waking up. So there's change happening here. And the change that's been happening in Australia has been profound. So the second point I want to raise along the path of how the advanced nuclear comes in is that proposal, you know, in South Australia, that's going to be brilliant for me if it happens, brilliant for my family. We're going to make a lot of income. It's so much bigger than that. I mean, that's a globally game-changing proposition. Yeah. If there's a trusted multinational service provider who can meet that back-end obligation up front for a new nuclear nation or existing nuclear nations with small fleets or even some existing nuclear nations with large fleets, that can lead to a massive tilt of investment away from fossil fuels toward the nuclear sector. These countries particularly, but not only in the Asian region, very, very fast energy growth. And they're going to need that energy. Now, we hear a lot about China and we hear a lot about India. Indonesia is going to be a country of 300 million people, and they're on track to triple their electricity consumption. And at the moment, that's a coal plant. Okay, fundamentally, that's a coal plant. Now, do you think they really want it to be a coal plant? I doubt it. Because that's more fuel dependence and that's more air pollution, and you're missing all of the benefits of a nuclear sector. And I am pretty sure that if that huge bottleneck, that huge stopper was taken away of that back end, you'd see a massive rebirth of what is excellent new nuclear today, light water reactor, in these fast-growing regions, which will be hugely material for the industry here in the United States. So the success in South Australia is absolutely your business. It is absolutely your business because it will change the face of the industry such that every growth trajectory currently in nuclear could be way wrong. Okay, everything could be way low because we're not just leveraging a few assumptions, we're actually changing the game. Which gets me to the advanced nuclear. Even getting to have that conversation, even getting that social change in South Australia such that we could have the investigation, advanced nuclear played a huge role for exactly the reasons that Rachel said. It creates a huge amount of permission for people to talk about nuclear and to have a new framework for understanding nuclear. And myself, and along with some others, including a Senator, Sean Edwards of South Australia, we worked very hard to get the advanced nuclear discussion front and centre in that discussion all the way through it. And it certainly featured quite prominently, and we got a lot of press to talk about recycling that fuel that we accept and putting it into fast reactors for clean power. Now, in the final analysis, the Commission didn't recommend it. They stopped well short of that. I wish they hadn't, but I find it hard to argue with them because I suspect they tried very hard and simply didn't find strong enough evidence to say, yeah, that can be we can start with that in mind. I think they went and looked and they didn't get enough. So I think we need to do more because they tried. They did try. And having that moving off the table leaves me having a conversation with South Australians about the geological disposal model of used nuclear fuel, which frankly I think should be moving towards obsolete on a technological basis. And I can tell you that's a much harder discussion. It's possible, but it's much harder because it means when an ENGO is using the word dump, they're not 100% wrong. They're not right, but they're not 100% wrong. I'd like that to be 100% wrong. It means when they're talking about the fact that we're probably going to use land that is sensitive to our Indigenous people, they're probably right. Whereas if we were doing it the other way, we can just kill that issue. Yeah. So it needs to be part of the discussion if we're going to get that discussion to succeed. It would play an enormous role in having that success. Because instead of talking about disposal, we can be talking about recycling. Instead of talking about burying, we can be talking about clean electricity. And from the point of view of the South Australian people who need to decide whether they want to do that, it gives us something not to just accept, but to feel excited about. Yeah. Okay? Yeah. You know, I don't care how you dress it up. I mean, the science is kind of cool and interesting if you're a geologist, but it's a hole in the ground. Okay? And even though we're going to make a shed load of cash, you know, we still don't like the feel of it. And even as someone who likes nuclear, I don't like the feel of it. Mm-hmm. But you tell me it's about technology, and you tell me it's about recycling, and you tell me it's about new energy source, and you tell me it's about bringing technologies to commercialization that might then go to Asia and help them do the same thing. That's exciting. That's a vision we can get on board with. It all flows back down the chain. You know, these different components of nuclear are not in opposition to one another. And success here begets success here, and vice versa. Yeah. And we've got to think about it more in those terms.
Very good. Okay, a lot of different perspectives. One thing, you know, Rachel, you kind of gave us a little bit of your background and how you converted. How about Matt and Ben? How did you become so passionate about nuclear power, and just a little background for the audience?
I had a very similar journey as Rachel did. We started looking at climate change, became incredibly alarmed right after the founding of Third Way in 2005, and recognized immediately that we just weren't going to get there with wind and solar. Yeah. We've done a lot of work on that since. We actually did a video for non-scientists. You all would find it very basic, but to show that there's just no way to power the US grid or any grid with wind and solar. And when I used to, very early on in Third Way, I would come to NEI conferences, and I would inevitably be introduced as representing an organization that is the leading pro-nuclear group on the left, which I said was very nice to hear, but it was like being called the leading Major League Baseball team in Canada. There's just one. And that's no longer true. We, as Rachel noted, civil society and even some of the environmentalists are beginning to come around on this, and there's some very powerful and interesting forces starting to coalesce, so it's been really great.
Okay.
Yeah, there were a lot of things, and I'd probably highlight two, one sort of fairly practical and one more experiential. I'd left, I'd had big rebirth as suddenly realizing I was passionate about sustainability after I'd become an occupational therapist. It's like, oh, shit. So I went back to university and took a master's and then got into the workforce and, and moved toward climate and energy. So I had some practical exposure to trying to do what at the time was the profession of sustainability, I guess, particularly with a focus on climate change. And so we did a lot of work in adaptation. There was a lot of government money in climate change adaptation in Australia at that time. So, we would do 100-year plans for a city like Melbourne in climate change. Now, that's a good way to get to know how big the problem is, because you've got to look down the pipeline and see, well, what are the projections and what are we actually going to need to plan for? So I'm looking at that and going, okay, well, that's not very good. And then on the other hand, we would get a little bit of work, there was less of it, but in the mitigation space, bringing the emissions down, which fundamentally meant three things: renewable energy, energy efficiency, and offsets. Basically, it was your three options. And so I'd do a little bit of that, and I'd see how much work would go into getting something done which was tiny, and I'd go, that's never going to work. For example, going through a process of trying to make it happened to be a car park for an arts facility, carbon neutral, so-called, through the official processes. And it was torturous. A torturous, difficult process for what ultimately was a pretty small amount of emissions in the final analysis. And meanwhile, a few hundred kilometres down the road in the Latrobe Valley in Victoria, they're digging up dirt, brown, sloppy lignite coal, and just burning it for electricity. It's like, well, if we think this is a problem, the place to solve it is over there, not in the Melbourne Arts Centre car park. So I realised that the scale of the solutions that I was sort of being fed and offered as the acceptable, okay ones just weren't big enough at all. Now, that didn't mean I didn't flip on a lid like that. I kind of went very quiet for a few years and just sort of stopped talking about it one way or the other. So I just started listening more than objecting. So if you have someone who's anti-nuclear and suddenly they stop objecting so much, but nor are they agreeing with you, they might be doing what I was doing, which is going, I might have been wrong. And that might take them a little while. But the other thing I want to raise, which is really, really important, was the role that Barry Brook played for me. So Barry Brook's a friend of mine, mentor, and he's one of my PhD supervisors. And he happened to live in my hometown of Adelaide. And I was reading his blog, Brave New Climate, where he was doing so much work debunking climate change denialists and doing a great job of it. And we had a really prominent one in the Adelaide University. So I'd read those posts because I was into that at the time. Then I'd flick through his blog, as you do, and I found this guy, one of the smartest, most charismatic, intelligent people I'd ever met, was profoundly pro-nuclear. And that's one of those moments where you go, huh, right, okay. And it's really helpful because it gives you someone to look at and go, I could handle being like him. I can handle being like that person. You've got to look across and see something you like. If you look across and see something you hate, be it values or all sorts of things, it makes it so much harder to make that journey. So Barry's role was huge, and part of the blog I write is part of helping other people do that too, providing that bridge to get across and say, yeah, I don't have to leave all my values behind. My values are still alive over here. This is just an issue that I can have a journey on.
Can I add one point on my journey? In the 90s, I traveled, one job I had in the White House was I traveled with Al Gore for a couple of years, and I traveled with him when we went to Chernobyl. And going to Chernobyl made me profoundly pro-nuclear, because when you go there, you realize that, and you all probably know, the Russians basically did everything they possibly could to blow that plant sky high. To call it malpractice is such a massive understatement. And I got back and I thought, man, our plants must be really safe because surely they're not that stupid. And if that's what it takes to create really the only nuclear catastrophe in the history of the civilian nuclear power, I thought, all right, this is a great industry. And I think the lesson that we ought to learn from Fukushima is similar, which is you get this world historic event, bad things have happened, we learned lessons from it, and the impact on the country and the region and the world was very, very low.
Anecdote on that. The day I gave my first coming out of the nuclear closet presentation in Adelaide, which went really well, was May the 8th, 2011. 3 days later, I'm on the weekend watching a big wave sweep across Japan, and hours later I'm hearing about a nuclear emergency, and I'm looking up at the university going, you bastard. I'm thinking, well, you know, sometimes when you make a big change, you get sent a little test. And
I got to tell you guys, you're very inspiring, because I don't think most of us in the audience have thought it from the same perspective as we've gone through some of this stuff. So now we'll take questions from the audience as well, so you can use your devices to submit questions. But let me ask the panel. So if we could hit the reset button on nuclear energy, what would be the most important factors for influencing opinion leaders and public understanding and support for nuclear energy as part of our portfolio? Because we've been working on this for a long time. We haven't made a lot of progress, so we could use some of your insights and advice.
Yeah.
I'll start while these guys are. I think the most important thing would be to emphasize the future of this industry. Not the difficult present or the gloomy future, but the extraordinarily bright, techno-positive future. I mean, I often say that the pharmaceutical industry makes all its money right now selling statins and Viagra. But they advertise that they're going to cure cancer. And because that's what not only consumers but policymakers want to know about your industry, is that there is a bright horizon. The fact is there is a bright horizon, and I firmly believe this industry needs to emphasize that much, much more.
Yeah. I also think those conversion stories are really powerful. Because they, as Ben said, give people a bridge and sort of show, oh yeah, people like me who used to think how I think and who share my values are now talking about something I haven't really thought about or used to be opposed to, and maybe I should really reconsider. I think just talking amongst yourselves isn't going to get you there. This has got to crack open and be a much bigger conversation. For one thing, nuclear is rarely raised in the standard climate conversations, or even when people talk about clean energy. And really, it's like the proven, scalable clean energy. And it's reliable, which is a factor that needs to be discussed more. So in your communications, talking about the unique attributes of nuclear that really, the clean air, the climate, the reliability, the scalability, there are no countries that have decarbonized without a significant use of nuclear. And when you look at the fastest decarbonization scenarios, they involve nuclear. So you guys need to start engaging in the conversation of climate, even if it's uncomfortable for some of your investors or some of your members. You just can't ignore it.
It's a good question, Bill. I think that in some ways nuclear happened slightly before we needed it, if you know what I mean.
Right, I agree.
Yeah,
And
that's so right.
in that respect, even perhaps slightly before it was ready. I mean, you wouldn't want to not have it, but it's been there through a bunch of decades where a bunch of its advantages were fundamentally meaningless to society, fundamentally didn't matter. And so thinking in terms of a reboot is actually a darn good idea, because it can precipitate a reappreciation of what it has and what it brings. And I mean, what I was just thinking of, Catch, I'd want to raise the safety issue on that. What would we reboot? What would we do differently? Right. You've got to think differently about that. I mean, I think there are a few people starting to say it. I'm certainly going to say it. It's not your damn product, okay? It isn't your product, okay? I flew here from the other side of the world, okay, and safety is not the airline's product. The product was my journey, okay? And when I see an airline ad, sometimes it doesn't even have a plane, okay? Because they're selling an experience. So safety is your job. Okay, I don't really want to know what your job is, and energy that doesn't kill me is really the least, that's a really low bar for me, okay? that needs like really serious normalization. And I understand how it came about, but it needs a rethink where, we think saying safety, the more we say it, that there's some neuro-linguistic program thing where people like robots are going to go, oh, safe. Actually, they don't. They go, oh, dangerous. Why are they still talking about this? Okay? Stop. If it comes up, you've got the information and you can have the discussion, but it is not your product. It's your core business. So that, I would say, needs a complete refresher. And I guess the other thing I would try to do if I could reboot it would be to normalize nuclear fission in a framework of energy progress. That it's simply the next logical step and a phenomenal next step in what has been a pretty rational framework of energy progress for humanity, from biomass and dung and wood through to charcoal, and then coal, and then oil and gas, and then a little bit of hydroelectricity. But really the next step was fission, stepping away from combustion altogether, a completely different process. Right. It's not even the chemical process of combustion. We found a new way to make heat. And all these boxes that we've been ticking all along, and every one of these energy sources, we tick it a couple more boxes, or it does these ones a little better, and then this one comes along and it still gives us all that, but now we're getting this, which is why I say maybe it even happened a little too soon before we were appreciating, and now we're getting this quantity of energy without even having to burn anything. Right. Okay, I don't think the broader public even appreciates that fission isn't combustion. Okay, they think you're burning something because we say we're burning something. You're not. You're not burning anything. It's fission. It's different. So, I would want to reintroduce as part of moving along a trajectory of human progress, which has been something we've all been doing all along. And funnily enough, when you do that, you think about a windmill. Right? Good. Which direction is the windmill going?
Couldn't agree more with Ben on this. But one other point, understand who your audience is. Yeah. Your audience is not the general public. That is not an argument we can or will win. We just aren't going to. What the general public wants is reliable, cheap energy. They don't understand where it comes from. They don't want to understand where it comes from. I have sat in endless focus groups and watched people talk about it. You can get them to say they're very scared of nuclear. But
without a doubt.
But the amazing thing, when you do focus groups, you separate men and women. And women say, well, I don't know anything about energy. And men say, I know a lot about energy, and then everything they know is wrong. Which is not surprising to any of the women in this room. So you hear men say things like, well, there was that big nuclear waste accident when they're talking about the coal ash accident. I mean, they literally have no idea. The people that this industry needs to reach are policymakers and the people who have influence on policymakers, not just in Congress or in Washington, but in, as you know, of course, in state legislatures and in PUCs and in other places. Stop trying to change the opinion of the public. It just can't be done, and it's not really that important. Policymakers understand that the public doesn't know anything about energy.
I only partly agree. That actually may be different in the United States, but I do get advertised to by other energy industries. They do constantly want to be reminding me what they're giving me in a positive way, be it gas. I can still sing the natural gas jingle from ads in Australia when I was young, right? Sitting there. I do think it needs to be normalised. I mean, I don't think it needs to be explained. Education is a thing that needs to be done right, but I do think it needs to be normalised in the sense of, yeah, it just is. Yeah, well, yeah, it's a nuclear plant, but I've got my electricity, yeah, it's from the nuclear plant. But I do agree with you, and this was certainly part of what happened in Australia, is creating enough safe space for the policymakers to come forward and actually start dealing with something which they otherwise simply regard as electoral liability. And that came from broadening out the people who are giving these messages. So it felt fairly small to start, but then more and more different stakeholders started doing it. Universities, academics within universities, industry organisations, business groups, unions, various parties started saying a remarkably small set of key messages. Again and again and again and again and again and again. Okay, it's like that great cartoon about curing polio that I think Gates Foundation have, where some guy wants to build nanobots, and they're like, no, we're doing the right thing. You can't overcomplicate it, but they need to hear it well, this is what happened in South Australia. They needed to hear it a lot. They needed to hear it broadly. They needed to hear it consistently for them to feel, okay, this is safe. We can pursue this now.
Okay, look, one thing, let's go. We've got our first poll responses ready. Here we go. I think.
It's not ready. Let me go to a question, Bill, and maybe they'll put them up during
Okay.
So I have a two-part question for you guys from our app. The first part is from Tina, and it'll be interesting to hear your response to this. Is it harder to convince people already in the industry about the promise of nuclear energy? And we've addressed this a little bit with the airline analogy. What can we learn from other industries to promote the growth of nuclear?
Wow.
Those are both really
They're really good
tricky,
questions,
yeah,
really interesting
and,
questions.
Things I haven't thought about.
There's something in that first one, definitely. I see a real dichotomy in the people I meet in nuclear, and there can be a bit of a different split between what you might term establishment and what you might term advanced nuclear, where, yeah, there seems to be a certain vibe that's so entrenched with nuclear about, I think you were discussing it earlier about problem, difficulty, slow. I enjoyed the chairman's speech this morning in some respects, but I have to say that, you know, to describe the situation at the moment as economic headwinds, I find ridiculous. I find that ridiculous. I think the house is on fire. The plants are closing. And to suggest that that will be solved with the same, I think, methodical and collaborative approach as we've addressed past problems, I think that is denial, because I don't think that's going to be the case at all. So yes, I see a deep disconnect there between what's going on and the way the problems want to be approached. And I see a real reticence to speak about some of the absolute core advantages of the product, which I also find remarkable, and I think there are some split incentives. So yes, sometimes actually I find some of the toughest conversations are internal conversations.
Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're trying to convince, it depends on what you're trying to convince people of. If you're trying to convince people that there is a bright future for nuclear, I think that does seem to be a challenge when you're talking to people in the industry. And my experience is that people assume that the way things are is how they will stay. And then, you know, people like to talk about how terrible it is. So, for example, you know, whether nuclear is economic or not. Well, there's a lot that can be done to change the economics. Nuclear is discriminated against in all sorts of ways. And those things are changeable. So in addition to the groups that I help coordinate on clearing a pathway for advanced nuclear technologies, we have other people working on looking at what are the economic what are the policy levers to help make the current generation more cost competitive. And there are things that can be done. They're going to take work and they're going to take smart communications. But we need the industry to realize that it's even possible before they will begin to really fight for making that happen. So I think understanding that things can be done. If you look at, you know, the incredible speed at which we got legislation passed on the advanced reactors, we started working on this 18 months ago because we decided we didn't want to accept how things were. We didn't want these 50 companies we discovered toiling away in obscurity who the DOE and the NRC didn't really know existed to all leave the country. That wasn't acceptable. So we thought, okay, well, what can be done? So we need you all to start going, what can be done?
Can I answer the second part of the question?
Sure.
I think there's a really interesting industry to use as a model, and that is the privatization of space travel and space, transportation. You all have seen this, but you've got these private companies. They're funded by venture capital. They do have billionaires behind them, but so does advanced nuclear, you heard earlier.
Some
Bill
of the
Gates
same ones
and
even.
Peter Thiel and others. Yeah. And they were told several years ago, good luck building competitive rockets that can move satellites into orbit or can resupply the space station or do anything beyond that. And they have completely proven the critics wrong.
Yeah.
And they've worked in a public-private partnership in a heavily regulated space in a very, very effective way. And we think there's a lot to be learned from the Mojave Spaceport, which could be the Idaho National Lab. There's all kinds of overlap.
Right.
Yeah.
So on the note of the politics, kind of getting another reset, right? An opportunity. 2017, new president, new Congress, new administration. A lot of changes at the state level. So it would seem to be a big opportunity. What's your perspective on our best approach to leverage that opportunity with all that change?
I could start on that because I'm the political guy. I actually don't know the answer if Donald Trump wins the White House because he hasn't been clear about where he stands on energy issues. I think it's probably a good opportunity. He seems to be somebody who's interested in new business ventures. But I will say if Hillary wins, and my colleague at Third Way chairs the nuclear subcommittee of her energy policy group. She is extraordinarily interested in Generation 4 reactors and in finding ways to help this industry keep the existing fleet open because she recognizes the climate change imperative. But something that you should be aware of, unless there is a political cataclysm that nobody is predicting, the Republicans will remain in control of at least the House and maybe the Senate. The Senate will be one vote either way. But they will have the House. What that means is that Hillary, if she wins, will be the first Democrat to be elected president that does not control both houses of Congress in the first 2 years since Grover Cleveland. And that is enormously important because Democrats want to do things when they become president. They really want to govern actively. She will be no exception, but she will have to govern in a bipartisan way. And this is one extremely promising avenue. When you can get Jim Inhofe and Sheldon Whitehouse on the same bill, you have real prospects for moving things forward.
Rachel, any thoughts?
I think that pretty much sums it up for me. Sorry, I think I'd reinforce that based on experience, that the further to the left you can get a yes on nuclear, well, everything to the right of there is just clear air. That's sort of been our experience, and remarkable conversations start happening. And now for us, it was Jay Weatherall it was that figure that I described earlier. And there's just been a remarkably wide open space there. And that mostly that comes down to climate change. It mostly does come down to climate change to get that argument further to the left. And I think now that you have actually now experienced plant closures here in the US, you've got some serious and really seriously scaring hard numbers to work with about what happens to emissions when that happens. So it's bad news, but by God you can do something with it to pull that argument further and get more clear air.
I actually think there's a lot that can be done on the right. I think the right is sort of waiting to figure out what they can say on climate because they're realizing they can't ignore it. And honestly, they've got a lot of great things they could say if they would start to talk climate, and nuclear would be a wonderful thing for them to start advocating for because honestly it would make the left look bad on climate. They could make an end run and have some great things to say about what they've been supporting. See, they could say, see, we've been supporting stuff that was great on climate all along.
Right. Interesting.
And they'd be right.
Yeah.
It would be right.
So a question from Doug, who thanks you for all the several great ideas that you've given this group already. But if there's one thing that you could have this entire hall walk out of the room and do, what would that be?
Act. It's everyone's job. If safety is everyone's job in this industry, and I bet you've heard that a million times, I'm telling you, making yourselves and your industry popular and loved and something that people decide they want to go into bat for is your job. I'd speak especially to the young gen, which I think are the guys in the pink shirts over there. If there's any spares, just... I'll take one. I think that's hugely your job. You know, some friends that we're batting around with are talking about how nuclear can become the punk rock of environmentalism, right? Like, nah, it's cool over here. This is really what it's about. And frankly, you've got so much to work with in that regard. So I would say to the young gen, do your jobs and do them brilliantly, but take that on as part of your job is making nuclear cool, frankly. I think it's incredibly cool, and I think advanced nuclear is unbelievably cool. And there's, I just think the power of that's underappreciated. I mean, we've all heard it and said it in a million ways. What is it about solar panels? They just make people feel good. I mean, there's some appreciable energy in it, but yeah, it's the visibility, it's the feeling that they've done something, and they're trendy, you know. There's 1 million of them in my city now. There's 1 million solar systems. So we know, and there's only about 1 million people, by the way. And so we know what it can do now, and it ain't that much. Get nuclear popular.
I agree. I'm neither young nor a gen, so I don't need a shirt. But I would, very similar advice, which is believe that this industry is vital. And you need to go out there and fight in every arena. Fight in the climate arena to make clear that it's terrific if we could get 25% of our electricity mix from renewables. That's going to be really hard. And where are we going to get the other 75%? And you know, so fight with the environmentalists, fight to keep the plants open, fight to get this industry to focus on the future. There is incredible prospects out there.
Guys, how do we get more integrated with the environmentalists? I mean, what do we, you know, we traditionally, you know, we end up to be a little bit of an island sometimes, and we, you know, so help us think about how do we reach out to the environmentalists to become, you know, allies on this together, as opposed to, you know, it's more one-off, we'll hear things, but how do we do that?
You need to start by talking about the attributes of nuclear rather than just the safety. You need to start talking about the unique attributes for addressing climate, the unique attributes for addressing global development, for lifting people out of poverty. You know, reliable, low carbon energy that also uses very little land. You know, talk to conservationists. If you talk about, you know, the energy density of nuclear, is honestly a really successful argument with conservationists. So we have had a lot of practice now going to environmental funders and environmentalists of all stripes and reacquainting them with the facts that they may never have heard, because traditionally, just like I experienced growing up, they've only heard the negatives about nuclear. And a lot of people don't even realize the density. They don't realize that it, honestly, a lot of people don't realize it doesn't produce CO2 emissions. So, you know, even making those basic arguments could get you a long way.
So help me out. So we've made a lot of those arguments, but maybe to your point, Matt, we've been making them more in the public venue. And we need to get, you know, we need to really kind of look at where can we partner with some folks to maybe help them help us tell the story. I mean,
I think it helps to have third-party validators, because inevitably, and particularly on the left, industry is seen as suspect.
Absolutely.
So the fact that you now have third-party validators, you have conversion stories to tell. The other thing is highlighting people like Jacob DeWitt, the young innovators in the space who are doing it for climate reasons. Jacob DeWitt his company spun out of Y Combinator. There's nothing sexier than that. I mean, that's like the hot new.
They have a pool table.
Yeah. That is like the hot new Silicon Valley, you know, incubator. So you have stories about innovation to tell and about entrepreneurship to tell that really help change the whole. I mean, it's hard to keep telling the same old stories with the same old industry.
It really is.
Guys.
It is. You kind of talk to yourself.
So you need new, unexpected people to highlight.
That's
Go
great,
back.
great feedback.
The other thing I would offer is all of you have contacts in academia. You've had professors in nuclear engineering, whatever. Go back and talk to them, get them to help. There are incredible, dynamic young people like Rachel Pritzker, who teaches at Berkeley, who have been out there proselytizing for this industry. I think Rachel's right, the big utilities have a hard time, frankly, making this case, but the small startup companies and the people who are not making money from this have much less
Stronger voice.
Yeah, and what I'd add is that same with all the other communications, know your audience is rule one. And so I understand that if you're talking about the environmental movement or the environmentalists, know and understand that to some extent you're not going to get them.
Yeah.
There's going to be certain organisations and certain people that you're not going to get, and that can't be your goal. What you actually mean when you're saying how do we get involved with the environmentalists is how do we get involved with their audience? Because I was going to tell you, once you break it down, the so-called huge environmental movement can often turn out to be a relatively small number of relatively key people with a lot of people following them.
Right.
And a realistic goal, you probably might pick up a few leaders along the way, you might pick up a few organisations along the way, but a seriously realistic goal is picking up a large slab of their audience because you've actually started representing their values better than the environmental movement are, who are shutting plants that are cutting greenhouse gas emissions, who are thinking maybe more hydroelectricity that's going to take up a canyon, who aren't thinking about how we're going to create synthetic fuels and all of the electricity that we're going to need for that to get our cars or to run our electric vehicles, who haven't done the maths on that. And suddenly they're
and the environmentalists are
marginalised.
relying on us keeping the developing world poor. None of their scenarios where you can power the world on wind and solar allow for growth of energy demand in the developing world. That doesn't reflect most people's values. If you really think about it, is it fair that we were allowed to develop and Africa and India and Southeast Asia are not allowed to develop? So those are values that I think a lot of people would share too.
That's great. Remind the audience, respond to the survey. Scott, I'm going to turn it over to you for some more audience questions.
Thanks. I actually have a pen and ink question here. We've talked about safety. Ben, you've talked a little bit about used fuel management from the Australian perspective, but in terms of moving our message forward as an industry, what do we do about the waste question? Because that's one that, if safety is the first question, waste is the second, right? So how do we manage that?
I think honestly, this next generation of technologies offers you a great new way to address the waste conversation. If you really care about waste, wouldn't you rather it be fuel for the next generation of designs rather than having to find a place to store it? The other thing is, volumetrically, if you consider the amount of power you get from the fuel, it's actually pretty small. People have this, if you compare all other energy sources, produce waste also. So this energy source, it's kind of an ideal source. It doesn't take a lot of material in, it doesn't have a lot of material out. We know how to store it. You can go up to the dry cask storage behind a plant, you can look, it's not leaking, and it's just sitting there waiting for the next generation of plants to burn it.
My strong advice, stop talking about it. Please, God, stop talking about it. It's not dangerous. You can keep litigating about it. Marv's lawyers will take care of it. But don't talk about it to policymakers because it's getting sorted out. There's been blue ribbon commissions. There's interim storage proposals. It'll take care of itself. It isn't the problem, and don't make it the problem.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. I think, if you really nail the advanced nuclear picture, it's fundamentally, it's solved. Even if it's solved in people's heads, in that the solution is either here or coming. Now that means convincing people, and that means something a lot firmer than we currently have. If I'm trying to convince people back home that this is what's actually going to happen with this material, if it's an intergovernmental discussion between the Australian government, the United States government, and a few other key players about using this revenue to commercialise technologies, it's a lot better than the prognostications of an analyst. Okay? Now I wouldn't need to say 2030 that recycling plant will be switched on. Gateways would be good enough, but it's quite reasonable and rational that people would want to see something they can believe. and say, well, are we actually doing this or not? Now, if we're not, why not? Why the hell is this not a super big priority to have an approximate deadline where we will start recycling used fuel? I think it's crazy that that's not an absolute priority to spread over a period of time. And the other thing that we've got to remember, which is something that a guy, Malcolm Grimston, if you don't know him, you should watch his talks and watch his informations, which is if the behaviour doesn't match what you're saying about something, people go with behaviour, and that is entirely rational. So as long as we're saying it's safe and proposing to bury it 500 metres underground, there's a mismatch there, and people are going to lean toward the idea that it is not safe. Yeah. If it was safe, I think the greatest thing the US could do would be to commit to a similar facility that we are going to start with, which is an above-ground dry cask storage facility, and say, that is our solution up until this gateway point where we will begin recycling it. Yeah. That's a believable behaviour. Yeah. So we're not going to bury it anymore. We don't have to. We already know how to manage it. I mean, to put this proposal together in South Australia, I did a lot of research into the dry cask situation and how it works. This was a stopgap solution that came in. And accidentally, several decades later, we've got enough data to look at it and go,
it's great.
It works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay? It wasn't intended, but here it is. They perform really, really well. They're unbelievably tough. The visuals of testing those things are fantastic. Okay, the grainy YouTube clip from the National Lab where they're smashing the train into the cask, it's like the best episode of Mythbusters ever. It's awesome. So you can actually show people and they go, that is our solution, and then what we're going to do is recycle it. That's a behaviour matching a message, which is it's safe enough to leave it there. In the last article that I wrote before I left the country, no, actually I had left the country, which I wrote the other day, I said, look, if we do this, and we get these casks, give me a crib and an internet connection, and I will sleep there for a week. Okay, I'll live there and work there for a week. 2, if it'll make the difference. But the point is, scientists, when they talk about safety, it becomes very probabilistic because that's the way we're trained. Now that's fine, but for most people, safety is a binary thing. It is safe or it is not safe. Yeah. I say it is safe, so I will just hang out there until everyone gets bored of me.
There's going to be real temptation in the US to start the yucca conversation again because Harry Reid is retiring. Don't do that.
Then nuclear will get stuck talking about waste again.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, I enjoyed the conversation. You bring a whole different perspective to our business, and I hope that everybody appreciated that, and I hope everybody learned something from it, because I know I certainly did, and I appreciate the advice on how we think about things differently, and let's give a big round of applause to his team. Thank you.